Good morning. I'm Celia Bertoia, the daughter of Harry Bertoia, and today I'll be talking about the Bertoia wire constructions, just like this little guy. Simple, but quite enchanting. Give it a white background there. And sadly, this is the only example we have live today because our other wire constructions are already at the Nasher Sculpture Center down in Dallas, Texas. They were slotted to have a Bertoia exhibition this coming October, but because of coronavirus, it is now postponed until late 2021. But it's still happening, and it's going to be good, so it will be worth the wait. So, the wire constructions were actually some of the very first sculptures that Harry did, that my father did, because they were so easy to construct. He began his metal work with jewelry and hand-tooled items that required no welding. He did learn about soldering early on, but it wasn't until, let's see, that would have been about 1946 that he learned how to weld. And as you can see, the wire is it's pretty darn simple. Just take a piece of wire and weld it right on there. Now this one does have a little missing head here. We'll have to get that repaired at some point. I have lots of pictures, so we will go through those. The wire constructions began early in his career, but he did get more complex with them, and they became more delicate as his career continued and he became more skilled as a welder. And ultimately, he did make some huge monumental commissions of wire construction. So this one is very similar to what we just saw live, but it was this actual sculpture on which Harry was working when one of the wires flipped off and made a pinging sound, and that's when the whole idea of the sounding sculptures came to Harry. So, kind of a famous little piece. And there were a large variety of wire constructions. This one is, who knows what you'd want to call it, but there are actually little colorful pieces in there too. Now we've got this piece. This is just a lovely little piece. And we had this in the house when I was growing up. And what we would do was, just a little tidbit, we would take a ping pong ball, put it at the very top, and it would kind of wind its way down and come out the bottom. So I always called it the ping pong sculpture. It is currently sitting in Maui at my sister Lesta's house. We were all quite fond of it because it was in my mother's house, in my mother's room, and her room was always kind of the coziest room in the house. My mother and father had separate bedrooms because my mother was a thrasher and Harry was a snorer, so they found it better to sleep separately. Now, there was a whole series of clouds, we call them. And this one was actually photographed over the pond at our Pennsylvania residence. The clouds were meant to hang, they were suspended. And they're called clouds for obvious reasons. They're just really light and airy and delicate. There's quite a large cloud suspended piece in 510 Fifth Avenue in Manhattan in the North Face building. They also have that. It used to be a bank way back when, and there's a huge screen panel sculpture in there. And that's the most obvious one. You can see it right from the windows. It was a Gordon Bunshaft architectural project. But the cloud is upstairs on the second floor, and it's hanging from the ceiling, and it's quite large. I believe it's about 10 feet wide. So that's one place you can go see one live. Now this little piece, and again, it's hard to tell here, but there were colorful ends on some of those crosswise pieces. And this was a maquette for what was called the Comet. And that was quite a large piece. I'm thinking it was something like 30 feet tall. But this little guy was just a few feet tall, but quite true to the larger commissioned piece. And there was a great story about a similar piece. It wasn't quite like this, but rather similar. In Flint, Michigan, I got a call one day from one of the city managers saying that in one of their shopping centers, they went down in the basement storage and they found this huge wire monster. They didn't know what it was, and they started doing some checking around and realized that this was probably the Bertoia sculpture that had been commissioned back in the 60s, I believe. And Michigan was one of the first states to do the indoor mall. And they had this huge wire piece in the mall for a long time. But they discovered it down there in the basement. They didn't quite know what to do with it. And the fate of that one is still undetermined. Okay, here's one that, as I was, we've been going through the archives. That's one of our projects. I've got my trusty man, Mike, here working as we speak. And I'm finding all these fantastic archival photos that I am guessing that Harry himself took the photos, but can't really be sure. But I found this one, a lovely little piece on feet. And this is just in the back of our house, in the backyard. So this was an archival photo. So I started to enter that into our database. And then, as often happens with this work, synchronicity, I happened to find this piece, which is the very same piece. I'll put them together. You can sort of find certain little pieces that match let's see, like There's this piece and this piece. So the positioning is different, but it's the same piece. So I was pretty excited to find that. And this piece, it's quite large. It's about 3 feet by over 5 feet wide. And in 2019, just last December, it sold at Sotheby's for $300,000. So that gives you an idea. And in live, to see it up front, it's just gorgeous. Now, this one too is really something. This is getting close to what we refer to as straw wire construction for obvious reasons. And I want to show you the close-ups because it's just really lovely. These little colored enamel buds. And this came later in his career. I think these were probably made in the 60s. And here's another detail. But the colored enamel really adds this whole other element to it. Yeah, I just love these. Now this is not the exact piece, but there's a very similar piece at the Crystal Bridges Museum in Arkansas, the Walmart Museum. And in fact, they bought a piece that was, again, quite large. I believe it was about 5 feet wide and 3 or 4 feet tall, and a beautiful piece. And it had sold at Sotheby's. In fact, at that time, it fetched the record for Bertoia. I think it was something like $675,000 was the final price. And at the time, I remember wondering, wow, who bought that piece? That is so beautiful. And then I discovered later that it was Crystal Bridges that bought the piece, so I was very pleased about that. Now, I do want to show you a couple things here. Okay, this is the Life and Work of Harry Bertoia by me. We have this available. You can get it autographed if you like on our website, shop, harrybertoia.org. Now, this is split in the pages here, but this was a huge monumental straw piece that Harry made for Northwestern Life Insurance Company. And each section of it weighed about 600 pounds and had inconspicuous feet to stabilize it. And this is actually Harry right here installing it. This, let's see there, but that person there is Harry. He preferred to do his own installations if he could. Now this Northwestern National Life Insurance, it was in Minneapolis and it's still there. And now it's the ING Reliostar building, so you can go check it out there. And the company requested that the piece be named. So as was Harry's habit, he came to the family at one dinner time, and we had all seen it, of course. We'd been to the studio. And he asked us to name it, so we came up with all kinds of goofy names. But as it turned out, finally, the people who named it were some Amish farmers who came to the studio. Interestingly enough, you wouldn't think about the Amish being interested in art, but they came there, and Harry said, "Well, what do you think of this? What do you think of this piece? What does it look like to you?" And they said, wow, kind of looks like straw. In fact, it looks like sunlit straw. And indeed, that became the name, sunlit straw. Uh, yeah, sunlit straw. And just a couple things in this book, Bertoia, the Metal Worker, by Beverly Twitchell, and it's a Biden publication. She did a magnificent job, really. We also have this at our shop. Oh yeah, I wanted to tell you something else about those beautiful pieces. Now, I'll just briefly read something that Beverly Twitchell has written for us here about the wire constructions. A sculpture in steel and brass has melt-coated or brazed surfaces that provide greater irregularity. And when she says melt coating, that would be, okay, you have this little piece and you take the brass, which gave that sunlit straw, the shiny golden texture, and you just hold a piece against there, and with the torch, you basically melt it right on the wire. It's very time consuming, but Harry enjoyed the effect because it was, yeah, like she says, irregular, a little bit bumpy, and interesting. We'll show you this piece so you know what she's talking about here. Now, this is just a magnificent piece. Okay, and I've got another story about this one. You can see all the little, like there's sort of some ladders and little critters in every direction. There's even a couple of rocks in there. I don't know if you can see those pebbles, but very playful. So she's talking about this piece, and she says, this delightful piece has strict frontality, but an unusually pronounced structural framing device. Small paired feet elevate the sculpture, making it less earthbound. Photographed at a slight angle, its shallowness is apparent, even though small brass sheets and wires bent into triangles are among the forms, enhancing its depth. As is characteristic of Bertoia's works of this sort and era, which would have been in the early 50s, the nature of the details and the unpredictability of their placement make the work at once fascinating and playful. The surfaces of the wires and pieces of sheet metal are enlivened by the touch of the torch as the molten metal left streaks and small drips. So yeah, it was an interesting time in Harry's life where he perhaps felt the freest, and he got into this whole playful thing. Now this sculpture is still within the family, and it was quite interesting. We were having some squabbles with my brother, my siblings. Unfortunately, we had to fight about the estate, which I never thought would happen, but it did happen. But as one of our board members and dear friend of mine, Bill Springer, was doing the inventory for all these estate pieces, this piece was actually hung upon a shelf in the Sanambian barn. It was, yeah, suspended on this little wooden platform. It was up above where people would walk, so no one would walk into it, and had been there as long as I could remember. So there is Bill up on a ladder trying to get a picture of it and measure it for the inventory. And he's grabbing up there, and before he was even fully up there, he felt this little piece of paper. He gets the piece of paper, and what does it say? But this piece belongs to Lesta and Celia, not Val, who we were fighting with. Part of the Valentina estate. And that's a whole long story. We won't get into it, kind of gory. But it was delightful because that at least meant we didn't have to fight him on this piece. It already belonged to my sister and I. So now here are a couple of other smaller wire pieces. You can see this one actually has balancing wires. So it's almost like a little tightrope. And Harry made several of those, probably a handful at least. And there's just something so charming about these wire constructions. Like he was just playing around, having a lot of fun. And here, again, not the greatest picture, but this is the sunlit straw. You can get a sense of the color of it a little better. And this was a large piece. I'm thinking it was something like 40 feet across. And still stands there today. So that really, usually we go for about half an hour. We're a little short here, but that is the story of the wire constructions. If you watch the auctions, you will see that these pieces tend to go for quite the pretty dollar. And I think it's just because they're so charming and delicate. It's so different from Harry's other work. The tonals, the sounding pieces. We'll give you a little sound here. Are much heavier and solid. So, yeah, the sounding pieces are so entirely different from, here, let's get this. There you've got sounding piece. Yeah, just vastly different, really. Yeah, they're both made out of metal, but gosh. And the spill cast, the little bronzes. Just so different. Delicate, honking. Lift weights with it. So just quite unusual and different. And again, he got much of his inspiration from nature. And if you listen to any of the other videos we've done, you know that we lived in a rural area, lots of trees, a pond, lots of bushes, and there were even some hay fields. So this was actually a common sight in our area. And there were Mennonite and Amish farmers, and they didn't use the square balers. They actually just put hay and straw in stacks. And yeah, looking at these details again, So he would melt coat the wires with brass to make them kind of sparkly, but not too shiny. And then putting on these colored enamel ends. All of that took great finesse. But anyway, that is the story of the wire constructions. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I wish you the best. Good afternoon.